New information continues to come out after an apparent assassination attempt of former President Donald Trump at his Florida golf course. The man in custody is being charged with federal gun crimes. Authorities are now saying 58-year-old Ryan Wesley Routh was camped outside the West Palm Beach golf course where Trump was playing for nearly 12 hours. He was arrested after authorities spotted the barrel of a gun poking out of the bushes. An AK-47 style firearm and scope, along with two backpacks and a GoPro camera, were found at the scene. Routh faces charges of possessing a firearm despite a prior felony conviction and possessing a firearm with an obliterated serial number. Additional and more serious charges are possible as the investigation continues and the Justice Department prosecutors seek an indictment from a grand jury. Of course, this incident also comes just 2 months after the former president was shot in the ear at a campaign rally in Butler, Pennsylvania.